Thank you for attending today's Pivotal webcast. A bit about the On24 interface before we begin. At the bottom of your audience console are application components, including Q&A, resources, help, and media. Your audio is being streamed through your computer and speakers. You can expand the center slide area by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right or bottom right corners. For technical difficulty, please click on the Help icon at the bottom of the console or use the Q&A component on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webcast. To see responses for yours and other participant questions, use the refresh link throughout the event. The resource list on the upper left-hand side of your console contains supporting resources with clickable links for you to view, including a link for the video replay. Enjoy today's presentation.
Good morning to the West Coast and good afternoon from the East Coast. My name is Dan Hyun, and I work for a company called IAC Applications based in New York City. I am a member of the Ratpack core team, and today we'll be talking about Spring Boot and Ratpack Web Framework and why you should be using both of them. So let's talk a little bit about Spring Boot. Spring as a framework and as an ecosystem has been around for more than 10 years, right? And Spring MVC specifically, Spring Web MVC specifically has also been around for more than 10 years. So when you consider a library that has that kind of longevity, but also just sheer market dominance, we're talking about a really solid library that you can really depend on. And in fact, many people do every single day. If we take a look in Spring, in Maven Central, we look for the original Spring Web MVC. The earliest one I could find was 102. That was released in 2005. It's 2016 now, and the framework has actually grown quite nicely with the changing times, all while maintaining backwards compatibility to the best of their ability until it's time to shut things down in the API land. But Spring Boot really takes all that experience and turns it into a really pleasant development experience. Some of the changes that are emphasized in Spring Boot is that you should create a self-contained artifact, whether that's a jar or an executable WAR file, or even a WAR file that deploys to a servlet container. Whatever your needs are, whatever your operational needs are, Spring Boot can obviously fulfill that. Another thing about Spring Boot is that we really don't want to use XML at all. XML not only looks very verbose and it's hard to type out by memory, but it's not it's not really type safe. So if you're trying to instantiate your application context with all your beans and all you have are XML nodes looking at each other, I mean, IDEs these days really help you in terms of matching beans and making sure that they fit, but let's just say you're using the standard text editor, that's not going to help you at all. So in Spring Framework's context library, there are a series of annotations that help you provide a Java mechanism for defining Spring Beans, and it's called a configuration. There is an annotation at configuration, which is able to declare a simple class with additional annotations like @bean and things like that allow you to define your beans in Java code. It has huge advantages. You got compile time verification that your beans are all okay. And yeah, that's the programmatic way of defining your bean structure. Spring Boot also has a big emphasis on integrating with some of the best libraries that are out there in the JVM ecosystem. So in particular, Spring Cloud comes to mind. Spring Cloud project has a whole bunch of libraries in it. Things that enable you to have auto service discovery, let's say if you're in distributed architecture, so that you can add just a single annotation and your service can automatically know where to look up for, oh, where does this service live, where does that service live, or I'm this service and I'm registering as a part of this group here. So I mean, the value of using a project like Spring Boot has all the value of using any kind of Spring framework. As I mentioned earlier, it's an industry standard. I don't think you'll find any JVM-based shop out there that has never used Spring before. Using a project like Spring Boot lets you focus on writing business logic like right out the gate. And for people coming onto projects or switching projects or coming to new companies or things like that, because everybody knows Spring and because you're really focused on writing components, everybody from all skill groups, from beginners to interns to senior developers, so on and so forth, they have an immediate impact and they just start writing code. And I think that's really invaluable. So getting started with Spring Boot, first I recommend visiting the Spring Boot page on the official Spring site. They have a whole bunch of great guides here. The documentation is amazing. The Java docs are amazing. It's very well documented and plenty of examples to go around. One of my favorite ways to get started with the Spring Boot application, however, is through the Spring Initializer. So if you go to start.spring.io, you can come in. Spring doesn't really care, right, like about what kind of build system you use. They support the two industry standards here, which are Maven and Gradle. And you can specify your version of Spring Boot that you like to use. This little search box here allows you to add libraries that are associated with starter packages. And Spring Boot starter packages are a collaboration between Spring team and all the various frameworks that are out there that provide basically the one annotation-based import that you need to provide on your main Spring Boot class, and you get all this functionality for free. We switch to the full version. You can actually see there's a whole bunch of stuff down there. Like this is the value of Spring Boot, right? This is in the Spring ecosystem, really. Like you have all of these available for you. Any kind of concern that you have, again, like around if you're doing cloud stuff, you want to make sure that your discovery is just taken care of, your routing is taken care of, that you have like a robust robust architecture set up, like if you're going with microservice architecture, things like logging. This is really invaluable. You can come in here, click off whatever you want, just hit generate project, and it'll download a zip file with everything that you need to get started. Really invaluable resource. So let's say we do want to get started with Spring Boot. I've gone ahead and created a basic project here. And this project consists of 3 modules, which really sit side by side. And I am going with a Gradle-based configuration. The first thing that I want to introduce to you is just something that represents a stereotypical artifact that you would find in your company's Nexus repository, as an example. So the build Gradle file for this is pretty simple. We just depend upon Spring Core for dependency injection, and we depend upon the Spring context here. So you could imagine that you would go through your application and you'd have bean definitions, and perhaps you have some JPA stuff set up or whatever. So for those not familiar with Java configuration, which has been around for a while now, but hasn't been popularized, I would argue, until perhaps Spring Boot, is this is now your replacement for the XML, for your application context XML. So you can think of this whole class as that application context XML documentation. We have 3 beans defined here. By default, I do believe these are scoped as singletons. And the beans are defined by their types, as you can see, and then their implementation. So, our string bean is just some kind of important message. We have, an important business service, which is just, a simple interface, just makes money. And we also have a message service, which is just send some kind of message. So like there's really not much to it. And as I was emphasizing earlier, if you have some kind of like dependency injection going on, this is how it would be accomplished. So this secret message would actually be injected with this secret message bean that's defined earlier on. As with all things, like bean order actually doesn't matter in terms of declaration, because Spring will create proxies and do whatever it needs to do. So yeah, these are just our basic implementations of our interfaces, and this is our collection of 3 beans. This is something. This module is just supposed to represent, that artifact that you would carry around with you. So I just want to show you for Spring Boot, getting started with Spring Boot. Our Gradle build for Spring Boot, I've taken a couple of things out and added a couple of things in. So in Gradle, since our Spring configuration project sits side by side with the Spring Boot demo and the Ratpack demo, we have a dependency upon the Spring configuration. So this will compile that artifact and bring it into the project and put it on this class path. I should mention here that you couldn't really do this with Maven. With Maven, you would have to publish the thing to your local Maven and then pull it in this kind of Maven standard format where you have your group artifact and your version coordinates. So a couple of things I want to point out here. Because we're using Gradle and we did download this from the Spring Initializer, we actually have the Spring Initializer applies a Gradle plugin for Spring Boot, and this is provided by the Spring Boot team. So this plugin provides a couple of really cool things. One of which is, if you notice this compile time dependency here on Spring Boot Starter Web, you'll notice that there's no version at the end of this. And typically when you use a project like Spring Boot, you're bringing in more than just 1 or 2 libraries. You're probably bringing in Spring Security, you're bringing in WebMVC, you're bringing in data, perhaps Hibernate, whatever else is available. If you refer back to that page, there are a ton of integrations for Spring Boot. When you apply the Spring Boot plugin, it'll actually make sure that all of these versions are in lockstep with each other so that you maintain binary compatibility. And these versions will be locked into the Spring Boot version that's exposed up here. For those not familiar with Groovy, because Gradle is essentially a Groovy DSL, the dependencies for this build script here has this kind of funky syntax, but if you're a user of Spring and you use a Spring expression language, this should look kind of familiar to you. What we have going on here is just a Groovy string interpolation. So this is nice because instead of repeating this a whole bunch of times, which we're already avoiding by using the Spring Boot plugin, you can kind of define this in this externalized key value pairs that's a Gradle construct. So it's a really nice way to keep all your versions locked down in one place. But other than that, to get a minimal Spring Boot application, this is really the only dependency you need. And even this dependency is overkill because it brings in Spring MVC. Spring Boot applications don't have to be web applications. They can be command line applications. Again, come back to our Acme configuration. Like, this is our Spring context. If you have all your bean graphs set up and you want to create a command line application that runs a cron job, but you need your object graph to be present, this is a great way to do it. You just bring in, you can bring your Acme configuration into the Spring Boot command line class and just hook it up and go. So let's take a look at what Spring Boot Hello World looks like. I just want to take a moment and reflect on the brevity of this class. If we take a look at line numbers, right, including new lines and all, we have 22 lines. And when you think about it, like if you think way back to like Spring MVC 2.5, let's say, or even like Spring 3.0, like pre 3.1 MVC, Like the setting up a Spring application was actually like better than the alternatives out there, right? Like setting up like a JWE application server as an example. But you still had to concern yourself with a whole bunch of XML in the form of your web XML, registering that Spring dispatcher servlet, right, to abstract away all of your application code from the servlet container. Perhaps if you add application context XML and bringing all that in, and Spring Boot really takes those years of experience in terms of creating these applications and distills it down to this 22-line file where you have a minimally viable application that binds to a GET request against the root path and returns a plain text response. And this is all it takes. I want to point out that that we have two annotations here. The one that may be new to you is the Spring Boot application. This one enables auto configuration, component scanning, bringing in Spring MVC, all that good stuff that enables you to write this really concise class. The controller annotation you should be familiar with by now if you've been using Spring MVC for a while. And of course, our two request-based annotations will inform Spring MVC about this endpoint. So yeah, let's just take a quick look at what sending a request against this kind of application looks like. Oh, I have a previous instantiation running. Let's run that again. All right, so we're up and running. Pretty quick, right? Quick to write, it's quick to get up. And if we issue a request against default port that everyone knows and loves, port 8080, we do see indeed that we get back our hello world. If we just turn on verbosity to see what requests look like, we can see that Apache Coyote 11 is the server that's being set as this response header, and also that we're returning as plain text encoded as UTF-8. So this is, this is quite compelling, right? To get off the ground, running takes almost no time, especially if you just go to the Spring Initializer, download the artifact, and just run the application. Like you're already off the ground at the click of a button. And I think that's really compelling. If you're not using Spring Boot, perhaps yet, like this should at least get you a little bit curious about what the possibilities can be like using Spring Boot. So, yep, I just want to point out again, right? There's no application context XML. There's no web XML. You don't have to like guess or Google what goes where. You just put annotations on and you're good to go. There's also no Tomcat configuration to play around with. But again, if you needed to get access to any of that kind of stuff, Spring's documentation is amazing. You should be able to just go in there and figure out what you need to do. So that's a little background on Spring Boot. Let's talk about Ratpack. So got Ratpack. Ratpack is hosted at ratpack.io. This is the GitHub repository and the organization for the repository here. But let's talk about Ratpack. So Ratpack is a set of Java libraries. You can think of them as jars. They're just jars. What do these jars do? They let you serve HTTP requests and a whole bunch of other good stuff along with it. So it's the entire project is at a minimum of Java 8. So you'll need to be on Java 8 to use Ratpack. Another very important thing to point out is that Ratpack has no knowledge of the servlet API. It's not a part of our runtime class path. We don't compile against it. We don't implement any of it, but we do provide analogs for all servlet API constructs like HTTP request objects, response objects, sessions, cookies, headers, all that good stuff. We don't have, because it's not a servlet implementation, We don't deploy to a servlet container. There's no war file. You just build a jar file and you're good to go. Ratpack is lightly opinionated. I say lightly because we do emphasize being asynchronous, lazy, using like functional approach to writing this code, making it immutable, composable, and a little asterisk here is that it's also reactive. As you can see by this ribbon in the upper right-hand corner, being reactive just means that it implements the reactive streams test compatibility kit, the API really, and we pass the tests on the TZK. So if you're familiar with other reactive stream projects like perhaps RxJava, you can actually use RxJava and Ratpack together. Yeah, if there are other libraries that are out there that implement the reactive streams API, it's quite easy to implement, to integrate it with Ratpack. Ratpack is also, because it's not servlet based, it has to take care of its own request handling, and that's done through a library called Netty. If you don't know about Netty, it is battle proven, and it is Netty is really good about minimizing resources. So we're talking about like CPU and memory, and yielding the capacity for doing large volumes, processing large volumes of HTTP requests, or really any kind of request. Netty is just the networking framework, and they do have support for HTTP and HTTP2 and all that kind of stuff, but it's not just limited to HTTP. So just to emphasize again, Ratpack, just a compile time, class time dependency. There's no SDK to download. There's no code gen that happens. Ratpack is definitely not MVC. There are no controllers here, and we certainly don't have views. Although we do support templating, and there's no table-based routing. This is more of a chain of responsibility kind of approach, and I'll get into that in a bit. Another thing about Ratpack is that it's currently at version 1.2.0, so we are API stable for the 1.0 branch, for the 1.x line of Ratpack. We've been API stable for about a year now, and we do have a small but growing dedicated community around Ratpack. And if you join us in our Slack channel, people talk about how they're using Ratpack or what kind of questions that they have about using Ratpack. So why would you want to use something like Ratpack? Well, Ratpack is what we would consider to be WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, that is. There's no quote-unquote magic, meaning there's no class path scanning, no reflection. It does what you tell it to do, which for some people they like that. For others, they want things to work out of the box. They just want everything to be hooked up and connected. But that's the core tenet of Ratpack. That doesn't mean that you can't write code around Ratpack that does have this quote-unquote magic. And indeed, some people are actually doing this. Ratpack is designed for developer friendliness and productivity, meaning since there's not much that the Ratpack server is actually doing, startup and teardown times of Ratpack servers are under a second, no matter what. Well, I shouldn't say no matter what. But really, this leads to productivity because we enable, for development mode, hot reloading. And it's interesting, actually, because as of Spring Boot 1.3, Ratpack and Spring Boot actually have the same mechanism for doing hot reloads. Spring Boot, as long as you add the dev tools that are provided by the Spring Boot team, as it detects changes, it will reload the entire application server. Same thing happens in Ratpack. If you happen to use Gradle, we have first-class Gradle support. So if you're running Ratpack through Gradle or you're running it through a Groovy script, as soon as it notices changes, it'll restart the server in the blink of an eye. This makes Ratpack great for rapid prototyping and not just prototyping, but actually evolving to a larger code base, because we have a lot of mechanisms around encapsulating pieces of data, or pieces of behavior rather, that describe how Ratpack should be handling incoming traffic. and it allows you to kind of separate and reuse bits of these code in a very nice way. Another value about using Ratpack is because it doesn't require as many resources, you can really reduce that that monthly footprint on your cloud bill, whether you're using AWS or Google Cloud Compute or Azure or whatever. You won't have to have as powerful nodes running out there. So all the code samples in this will be in Java, but for this first example of Hello World in Groovy, I'm actually, for Ratpack, I'm actually going to write this in Groovy. So the reason, of course, is to show how compelling it is to use something like this. So here is what a Ratpack Groovy application looks like in a script. So this grab annotation is baked into like Groovy scripts. It's basically a way to grab dependencies. You can use your familiar Nave and artifacts here. Group is io.ratpack. The artifact name is Ratpack Groovy. And the version here is 1.2.0, which is the latest stable version out there. What we do is we import this static Ratpack method. And what the static Ratpack method does is it allows us to start building our server, or really describing how the application should be handling incoming requests. So we define handlers, which I'll get into a little bit. And what we do is we end up binding a handler to the get of a root path request that comes in. And what do we do with this? We're just going to render hello Groovy. And that's it. This is an entire Ratpack application, the real deal. And this just to run this application, you just simply run Groovy and then the name of your Groovy script, which is hello Groovy in our case. It'll start the application, it'll start the server and tell you that it's in development mode and it's ready to start accepting requests. So you run a request against localhost 5050. If you read the log here, which is the default port for Ratpack, you should see hello Groovy. Just to show additional verbosity here. Same deal, plain text, char set in, UTF-8. Now what I want to show you is a bit of that prototyping and user friendliness, developer friendliness here. So we can actually start modifying this application while it's running, and we'll see the results immediately. So if we were to change this from hello Groovy to hello Ratpack, save this file, we're not touching the Groovy stuff, and we just issue a request again, turn off that flag. Hello Ratpack. This is really conducive to rapidly prototyping, let's say, a REST API that defines a couple of endpoints and could return canned responses that you eventually replace with real services and things like that down the road. So the same kind of mechanism is available in Java land through Gradle. You just, in fact, like if you were to run, Gradle run with -t, this would enable continuous mode. -t is the short name for it. Continuous is a long name for the flag. But basically, as long as you're telling Gradle where your main application should be running or what the name of the main class is, Gradle will take care of compiling everything, starting the application, and as long as you pass in this continuous flag, as you make modifications to your source code, it will reflect those changes immediately. The one caveat here is that any modifications to build scripts or settings or anything like that, any kind of Gradle-based files, like adding dependencies or removing dependencies, they won't take effect until you stop this command and run it again. So that's the one caveat that you should be aware of. So that's Hello World in Groovy. Let's take a look at what a comparable example looks like in Java. So coming back to our project setup here. This is kind of like the minimal Gradle configuration that you would need to get a Ratpack application up and running. You don't actually really need any of these dependencies here. Declaring the plugins through Gradle's experimental plugins closure, it allows you to bring in the Ratpack Java plugin, which will apply things and make your daily development workflow nice. Again, we're referencing version 1.2.0. And another plugin that we're bringing in is a plugin that's published by John Engelman called the Shadow plugin. And if you're familiar with Maven's Shade plugin, it accomplishes the same thing. It produces a single artifact that has all of your transitive dependencies packaged into a single artifact so that you can have a single artifact to ship around. It's really convenient. I highly recommend that you use it if you're using any kind of executable jar-based application. So let's take a look at what that same hello world would look like in Ratpack. This is basically it. If we compare the Groovy version to this one, you'll see that what we have in common is this handlers method and this get method. And we're making liberal use here of lambdas. A number of Ratpack APIs that's exposed to the user often take in actions or blocks of code, just something that is maybe given something, it's maybe not given something, and something happens within that. So you notice here, like get takes a handler, handlers takes an action, which is given a chain. Even the Ratpack start server, which builds a Ratpack server, binds it to some local socket and just starts accepting traffic. This takes a server's Ratpack server specification, which tells you how to build up a Ratpack server. So in this case, we're telling it, hey, like for all incoming GET requests against the root path, we want to just render out hello world to it. And to show that this does indeed do the same thing as the Groovy application, we'll just load. You can see this started up rather quickly. We are listening on port 5050, and just to show that, good on that. Yep, we got hello world. So again, since I invoked this in IntelliJ through right-click run on this main method, we're not going to get the reload functionality here. You would need to invoke Gradle run continuous in order to get that. But the reason I'm doing it this way is because I have a number of classes with static main methods that I want to run side by side. So that's basically hello world Ratpack in a nutshell for Java and Groovy. What I want to do at this point is start introducing the various components that you as a Ratpack user would come in contact with every day. And we kind of went over some of the names and concepts very quickly, but I'm just going to share my notes here. So in the resources that are available to you in the On24 UI, you'll have a link to my presentation notes. So this will be here. This is just hosted on my GitHub repository under the Spring Ratpack 2016 repository. And we're specifically at the Meet the API section. So here, I've outlined some of the major components that you would come into contact with in your tenure as a Ratpack application developer. And I've got links to Java docs and everything. So if we start at the top, we've got something called a handler. The handler is just simply this interface. It's a void, gets a handle, and works, and it's given some kind of context, whatever the context is. It's a SAM type, meaning it's a single abstract method type, which means you can use lambdas in its place. So you'll see that the Ratpack API has a lot of these SAM types, which make it really conducive to writing really concise applications that you can tell what it's doing at a glance. The handler is also the primary means of request processing. So the handler is the actual bit of code that you can, read things from the requests, write things to a response, like set a cookie or whatever, and either return a response at that point, or delegate to the next handler down the chain. So in this Ratpack Hello World example, the handler is this bit right here, this lambda expression. So we're given a context, and context has this render method, whatever that is. and you just give it an object and it'll render that back to the user. In this case, Ratpack has something called like a rendering and parsing framework. As long as you provide support for an object, you can just simply call render and it'll render it according to how you tell it to render it. We have basic support for char sequences, obviously, because we're passing a string in here. So let's talk about the context. In this Lambda, we have an object that we alias as CTX, which is really the context object. The context object is the primary means of reading request and response objects. The context is how you get to the actual HTTP request and response objects. And to just clarify here, these are not the request and response objects from the servlet API. These are our own HTTP request and response objects. We still provide everything that you would need: headers, cookies, session information. The context is also the primary means of inter-handler communication. And what that means is, because handlers can delegate to handlers that are farther down the chain, where chain is a collection or really a linked list or maybe a graph of handlers, it's a way to populate that. It's a way to like take information and add it to the context so that the handler down the chain can act on that information. The context contains a registry of application and request level objects. So these are all objects that are pertinent to the execution of this request. And it also provides easy access to really great features of Ratpack, which again are parsing, rendering, getting to HTTP concerns, and information about the execution that you're currently in. So I mentioned that the context is a registry. Well, it turns out the registry is actually also a thing in Ratpack applications. And registry is something like this. So in our Ratpack application, we've expanded this a bit. The new bits are this. So from the servlet spec, we have a registry method that when you pass it a registry, will start every context execution with this registry as its base. So for every request that comes in, you're going to have a message service, which we define down here as a single method interface that just has a string. And we just have our instantiation here, which just returns my message service. So this is an example of a registry. The example of a inter-handler communication is demonstrated here. So this chain, I've added an all call here. So this handler will be executed for every request that comes down the pipeline. This means that no matter what kind of request it is, no matter what path it is, no matter like what HTTP method that you're giving me, I want to apply this logic. So you can kind of think of it as analogous to a servlet filter in a way. I've heard it described before as handlers are kind of like servlet filters and servlets combined. But as you can see here, what we're doing is we're delegating to the next context down the pipeline, which is done through this next. And with this next, we're just adding a registry with an instance object. So finally, when we get to our request processing, we can retrieve these items that we've registered out of the context registry and make additional computations that we need to from here. So as an example, like context.get, we call by type, and we essentially get our type back that we've added to the registry beforehand. And this message service, which we've registered at the beginning of the Ratpack server instantiation, is also registered in the context and comes out. And we can just send, our message as well as the request at this point. And to just demonstrate what this looks like end to end, we have our application server up and running now. And if we again curl against 50/50, we do indeed see that we have our instant as registered by the all handler, and then we have our message service message that's coming from this handler that we defined at Ratpack server instantiation. So that's just some information around handlers. and registries and contexts and all that good stuff. So let's talk about integrating, at this point you have enough information to do some damage in Ratpack, so to speak. And what we'll talk about at this point is integrating existing, integrating Spring Boot, that is, with Ratpack. There's kind of two approaches to this. One is a Ratpack-centric approach in which you keep evolving your application in this manner. And what you can do is you can take your bean definitions and bring them into the fold. So, and by bringing them into the fold, I specifically mean adding them to this registry here so that they're made available. Let's shut down our server. So if we go back to our Ratpack configuration, or Gradle configuration, you will see that we have a Ratpack dependency, like compile Ratpack dependency Spring Boot. Like, well, what the heck is that? The Gradle plugin for Ratpack that is made available through this line here exposes this Ratpack object that has this dependency method, which when you invoke it with a string will actually produce the equivalent of this. So much like how we keep our dependencies in lockstep with the Gradle plugin for Spring Boot, the same mechanism is also available in Ratpack. And just like in Spring Boot, Ratpack has a number of modules that you bring into the class path to get additional functionality. And so if you end up with importing a whole bunch of modules in this kind of manner, this just becomes like noise and it becomes difficult to read. However, if you just isolate the part that changes and do it like this, is nice. So if you're going to upgrade a version of Ratpack or downgrade it or do whatever, you're never going to miss out and have incompatible binaries. So this is a mechanism that's a really nice way of keeping the verbosity out and making sure that all the binaries are compatible with each other. So if we take a look at what a Ratpack-centric application looks like, it looks something like this. So if we go back to our Acme configuration class, just as a refresher, we declared 3 beans here. One's a string, and then we have 2 services that are important to our business. So I just want to point out at this time that this Spring integration into Ratpack and vice versa is made possible through mostly through efforts from David Sire, who's a part of the Spring framework team. And it's because of his enthusiasm for Ratpack and seeing the potentials there that we can thank him for having this kind of integration that allows me to talk to you today about talking about integrating Spring and Ratpack together. So if you are building a Ratpack-centric application, that is, you are building your server yourself, and you are defining your chain and you're building your own registry, we do have available in that Ratpack Spring Boot library this Spring class, and on it is this static method Spring, which when you give it a configuration class will take care of building up your Spring application context and adding all those beans into your registry. And the way we can prove this is by running this example. You can see this message service. We don't have a message service like defined anywhere, right? Where this message service is coming in is through this project level dependency on that artifact, on that project that we're creating. So you can see here that we have our message service and that we're expecting it to return an important message. So when we boot this application and we run it, we'll see that Spring Boot is detected. The server starts up very quickly. It creates your beans, gets them in the registry, and if we make a request against 50/50, there you go. We get our important message. So this is pretty huge. You can see that if you've invested your tech mind share and stuff like that into Spring, and you have somewhat of a modular separation of concerns, like layered architecture kind of design, and you want to leverage all those beans that you have in your company, you can bring them in this manner. Now, if you are using an XML-based configuration, there is a way to bring that in as well. I encourage you to go look at Spring documentation around integrating XML and the Java-based configuration for Spring, but it can be done. I'm doing it in production today. That is combining Java configuration with Spring application context XML files. So it is possible, and it is done. So this is what it looks like to come from a Ratpack perspective. If we take a look at what it looks like to come from a Spring Boot perspective, is let's just refresh what it looks like from the Gradle perspective, Gradle configuration. So you can see the same dependency on that configuration artifact. And here, like I mentioned earlier, because we're not actually applying the Ratpack plugin to this application, we just bring this in by hand, which is no problem. And we're still using the Spring Boot starter for the web. Now, what this means is that we're actually going to be booting up Tomcat and Ratpack side by side. So we'll have Tomcat, the embedded Tomcat, binding to port 8080 while Ratpack binds to port 5050. And that looks just something like this. So if you recall, going back to our Ratpack Hello World application, what we do is we provide the handlers with our action of chain, which is precisely what this Lambda is right here. So we're saying we get a chain, we describe how we want to respond to HTTP requests. In Spring Boot, as is in the fashion and style of Spring Boot, all you need to do is apply your annotation here, apply your Ratpack, enable Ratpack annotation, and just define a component here, which in this case is the action of the chain. And this chain is just the logic that you care about writing, right? So this is it. If we run this code sample here, we'll see that it does indeed boot up. You should note that because of this annotation, Spring and Ratpack cooperate to build the Ratpack server with sensible defaults, and it'll be injected, that server will be injected with this action chain, and it will be able to serve this request on port 5050. So we got this message, hello from Spring Boot. So let's take a look at, that's what we expect. And indeed it is, and we do get back hello from Spring Boot. Just to show that Tomcat is also running, we can issue a request against port 8080, and this is exactly what we expected. We didn't define any kind of controller that's binding to the root path here, so 404 is exactly what we expect. And this is kind of the Spring Boot-centric approach. So instead of writing and defining your Ratpack server and taking control of that, what you say is, I like how Spring sets everything up for me. I just want to write the component that I care about, which is the piece that handles the traffic. And that's all I want to provide. And Spring Boot and Ratpack will collaborate to give you this ability. Now, some of you may be asking, like, why would you be using Spring Boot and like the embedded Tomcat and Ratpack side by side? Well, I mean, there are a lot of reasons. One could be like differences in volume, right? Like if you have, if you need to be able to handle a lot of requests for one specific component of your application, and perhaps your other side of the application is doing something like has like a CRUD admin or something like that. That's certainly a use case where you would want to use, Ratpack and Tomcat side by side. But here's an example how we're utilizing Ratpack running and Tomcat running side by side. So let's start with the Spring Boot components. Really, through the use of the controller stereotype annotation, we're binding two paths. One is to the root, one is to Ratpack. The root just returns this is Spring Boot, and Ratpack creates a REST template and issues a request against the Ratpack running server and returns that as a map, which should be rendered as JSON. In the Ratpack chain that we've defined, we've added two new handlers. One is for the endpoint getJSON, and the other one is for getBoot. And so the JSON simply creates a map that has a key of date and the value of now, which is just an instant represented as a string. And again, we're making use of the rendering framework in Ratpack, and we have first-class support for JSON, of course, which means that we can take this map and serialize it as JSON, setting the appropriate headers and things like content type and things like that, and send that back to the user. The endpoint on here called boot will grab an HTTP client out of the context registry that's provided from Ratpack server. This is a non-blocking asynchronous client. So when you issue a request against Spring Boot's embedded Tomcat container, we'll actually have to transform these asynchronous, the results of these asynchronous types as they come back. And so we're going to get the body, and once we get the body, we extract the text and say that we've received this from Spring Boot, and then render this string back out to the client. So just to quickly demonstrate these requests in flight, we'll start up the server, and we'll just go through and make our requests now. So first, let's take a look at Spring Boot. Localhost 8080, this is Spring Boot, right? This is the application here. Let's take a look at the root request for Ratpack now. So that's what we expected. This is Ratpack and Spring Boot. We're now going to take a look at the endpoint that Ratpack exposes for the REST template consumption, which is just JSON here. So this returns JSON as expected, and to demonstrate that we are setting all the headers correctly, you can see that, that content type is application JSON, and it is what you're expecting. So now if we make a request against the Spring Boot that issues the REST template call to Ratpack, we'll see that we get that JSON object back, which is great. And vice versa, we can also make use of the Ratpack endpoint that proxies a call to the embedded servlet container that's listening to port 8080/root. And this is what we get, and that's what we expect. So this is pretty much just the beginning of how you can integrate these two. Obviously, because you have all of Spring Framework's ecosystem available to you, it is quite easy to figure out what kind of components can work for your particular use case. At this point, I do want to share my list of resources that I recommend that you go follow up if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Obviously, the Spring Initializer is definitely go to. I have links to Ratpack homepage, our GitHub repository for the organization, where we have code samples from conferences we've spoken at, from labs that we've given, hands-on workshops, things like that. What we don't have currently are any kind of Maven examples, building with Maven, and it should be trivial to do, just no one has done it. So if anyone would like to issue a pull request of building Ratpack with Maven, we'd certainly take that for sure. We have a user guide. I do want to point out our Slack channel as well. So our community is small, but it is growing, and it is quite active. So if you just navigate over here, you can register and just start asking questions. We have a really good response time around this as well. We also do have a dedicated forum for Ratpack users. They'll come and ask questions here as well. But I do recommend going to the Slack channel over posting in the forum, since you'll also benefit from other people who may have encountered what you're trying to accomplish or have answers to questions that you may have. And last but not least, a colleague of mine, Dan Woods, who is also a core member of the Ratpack team, has finished learning Ratpack. So that is done, ready to go, and it's off to production, and it is slated to be out in May. So I highly recommend that if you're interested in Ratpack and kind of interested in seeing what are best practices, what are some use cases, Dan Woods has really nice examples in here and a very logical and clear progression of how to use Ratpack and all of Ratpack's features. I highly recommend it if you want to, if you're interested in this kind of stuff. I've read the whole book, and it's really great. So, and last but not least, I know I said that before, but for real now, I do have all of my presentation notes available in my GitHub repository under Spring Ratpack 2016 again. And all the code samples that that you saw today are also available. And my notes here also go through everything that I've discussed with you today. Thank you for your time. I'll take questions now.
Excellent. Thanks, Danny. All right, so first one is from Daniel, and I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. So Daniel asks, so Tomcat is your default run, right? Let's say JBoss, but how about even with the need to reconfigure? I had already answered that yeah, sure, you can run on Undertow. But regarding the need to reconfigure, wouldn't that sort of depend on whether they're doing like a embedded jar file or a WAR file kind of deployment, or is it just you have to recompile?
No, that's right. Like if you're if you're using an embedded servlet container, I'd say that you're pretty insulated from swapping out the actual servlet container that you're using, whether that's Tomcat or JBoss or Jetty or Undertow. But if you are producing a WAR file for an external standalone servlet container, which we actually do at our company, then you actually need the classes that inform Spring Boot on how to interact and configure how Tomcat should be running. So those are specific to the servlet container of your choice. So you probably would have to recompile and change the classes that you use there.
Yep. Cool. All right, so Daniel, hopefully that addresses your question. There's only one other question at this time, actually. So folks, if you have others, this is the moment. Ryan Bond from IO High Tech America asks, can you define multiple @bean action chains? Wait a minute, hold on, sorry, that character's got all funky. There we go. Okay, I had to expand it. Sorry. Let me repeat that. I apologize. So Ryan is just asking, can you define multiple bean action chains? Like an @bean annotation and then action chain?
Hey, Ryan, that's actually a really good question. I don't know why I haven't thought of that off the top of my head. You can certainly define multiple beans in terms of how the actual Spring integration with Ratpack is going to pull that in. I'm not sure how that will play out. But as far as just being able to define them, of course you can, in terms of how that impacts like what actions actually get bound. That I'm afraid I'll have to actually look into that.
Got it. Maybe that's something. Yeah, cool. Maybe that's something you two can also pick up on Twitter. I believe you had your Twitter handle at the beginning of your presentation, so that's something. Maybe you can pick up Ryan with him on the Twitters. Daniel Nathanson from AfterRec asks, he's considering using Ratpack with Spring Cloud. And is wondering how support for things like service registrations and Eureka type stuff would work. Spring Cloud would register with the port of the Tomcat server, but clients using that service would still want to sort of use the Netty port, right? So how would that work?
Sure, I have to admit, like my interaction with Spring Cloud is very limited. So in terms of that, I don't have a definite answer. Working with what I've just demonstrated, you can certainly have Spring Boot or the embedded Tomcat server, if you're using it, forward all requests to the underlying Ratpack server, which, you may not want to do that, but it'll work for the use case, right? The other thing is that I would probably think that you could configure that port actually through either a property file or through some kind of value that you pass to the annotation. But I would just go to Stack Overflow for that one, or Google.
Yeah, I know. I wish I had some more insight there too. I'm trying to remember what I've seen in the Eureka console and whether or not they pass through numbers. Those services when you do service registration. Yeah, that's a good one. Sorry about that, Daniel. Maybe we can, maybe Stack Overflow is a good place, or if you want to address that to the @SpringCloud open source handle, Spring Cloud open source handle, Twitter. I'll just hold on. Let me just pop that into the console here so that you can not have to remember or write down the handle. Okay. All right. So yeah, let's punt on that one and maybe try tweeting it, and I'll see if the other Spring Cloud engineers can perhaps comment on that. Shailesh Kini asks, so Danny, what do you recommend? Spring Boot centric or Ratpack centric? There's a loaded question, but hey.
Yeah, that's quite a heavy question there. I would actually, it really depends on like where you're coming from, right? So I would say this comes down to your use case. So if you are a Spring-oriented JVM shop, which I would say accounts for most of the Java-based shops out there, most likely you already have your Spring Beans configured and packaged in some kind of nice jar, right? So if that's the case, and your team is open to experimenting and playing around with, building the actual Ratpack server yourself, I would recommend going down Ratpack and pulling in Spring. If you are a Spring Boot first shop, and you want to perhaps maybe play around with Ratpack, you're not so committed to it yet, but you want to see if you like the look and feel of it, I definitely recommend doing the Spring Boot centric approach. This is also like in scenarios where you already have a Spring Boot application, but you find a use case for handling, large amounts of inbound volume that maybe for some reason you don't want to switch to Undertow or put like Nginx or something like that in front of it. That could kind of handle that for you.
Yep.
So it depends. It depends on your preference, how adventurous you're feeling, and what your company's like in terms of like what do your artifacts look like that you're producing, and are you Spring Boot already?
Yep. I think that's a pretty balanced response. I mean, that's a very open-ended question, and you tend to get answers like it depends when you ask for blanket recommendations. But again, Daniel Nathanson, who had the question on Spring Cloud a second ago, is following up and saying, hey, is Ratpack considering adding support for distributed tracing? Stuff like Trace or Adapter or Bitkin. Spring Cloud Sleuth provides this, but it doesn't. We don't support Ratpack sort of ingress and egress points.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. We do have an open ticket on integrating distributed tracing. I think for us, we have an issue open with perhaps looking at Zipkin and pulling that in and getting that working. But I mean, if you are up to implementing that and adding that functionality to Ratpack, like we'd be more than happy to have that. I think that's something that we would need, and I think there are some discussions on our GitHub issue tracker right now. So we do
cool.
We do want it. That's for sure.
And another comment, by the way, on the Spring Cloud thing from Daniel's Spring Cloud question. He was just commenting, yes, you can. There is configuration to change the port, but then the health check endpoint provided by Actuator wouldn't be found. Oh, right. Yeah, of course. Duh. Yeah, because that's all going to get right.
That's pretty important, right?
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's not necessarily the service that's getting registered in Eureka, right? It's like the thing you're writing is getting registered, but then the system, Actuator vaults ports. I don't know. Maybe you could somehow register those as services too. That could be weird, but yeah, maybe Daniel, maybe try hitting up the @Spring Cloud open source handle for that one, and hopefully, maybe we can help you figure that out. But or Josh Long, Starbucks man, I know he's got some experience with that too. Spring Cloud Stack inside and out.
So I do want to point out that Ratpack does have a metrics module. In particular, we integrate with Drop Wizard metrics. So however you're reporting that, you can configure an endpoint for your metrics, and perhaps you can point it to use that endpoint instead of actuator. And you could also forward requests from Ratpack to the Spring Boot actuator endpoint. Although I don't know how useful that would be, since actuator is looking also at servlet statistics, right? But for other things, like any kind of custom metrics that you have that are not, servlet container specific, would certainly benefit from, having that request come in through Ratpack.
Yep. Oh, cool. One of the attendees, Mark Puckett is actually just published a little piece of code there, like an actual wrapper that looks like, it looks like it's just, oh, that's cool. Wow, dynamic coming in over a webinar. That's awesome. Okay, that is actually like
that totally makes sense.
In 10 years, that's awesome. This guy, you just won the webinar award, buddy. Way to go, Mark. That's really cool.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So what Mark is showing here is that you have access to the actual actuator endpoint and all the data associated with it. So from Ratpack land, you should just be able to iterate through that. And it looks like you're using Groovy here. But yeah, the principle stands that you can go through the actuator endpoints and find what you need, which is, that's awesome.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, and you realize, you can code boot apps with Groovy as well. But yeah, totally. So cool. That's super awesome. Thank you, Mark. That's wonderful. Awesome to see that. Okay. Well, I think that seems to have exhausted the question queue. I'm going to start doing just a little bit of housekeeping work, and then if you have a question, feel free to. So we are recording this event. It will be posted to spring.io/video and also spring.io/blog. Usually within about 2 weeks at the outset. Hopefully, I can find, but that's sort of that's our service level agreement at the outset. And the replay, and normally it would be slides, but boss Danny here did a whole demo and no slides, so we'll have that posted for you to share with your colleagues and go over if there's something that you missed that you want to check out. If you travel a lot, a YouTube downloader can be a great way to take these webinars with you on the road and watch them from your tablet or what have you while you're on a plane. So with that, I think if you're looking for bits and software, just realize that we used to have HTTP downloads enabled on the Spring website, and we cut that off a few years back, and really try to encourage you to download it via Maven or Gradle. If you are on a military network or a closed network or stuck behind 200 layers of proxy servers and you desperately need HTTP downloads for some reason, you can get them. You can get a hold of Spring Boot from repo.spring.io. Again, repo, R-E-P-O, repo.spring.io, and that is our Artifactory service, our nightly build, and it is a way that you can get HTTP downloads. Not easily, mind you, but you can get them. And then Danny, what's the best way to get a hold of Ratpack bits? I saw your Gradle example before. Is that the Gradle is the best way for you too?
Absolutely, yeah. All of our stuff is in Artifactory and Nexus. And Maven Central. So if you do need to grab the artifacts, I'm not sure if we post the artifacts to GitHub. I should check that, but that may be a dead end actually. But yeah, through Artifactory or through JCenter and Maven Central.
Excellent. Well, excuse me. I think that's it. Just a quick comment, or actually, it is a little bit more of a question from Shailesh Kinney, he asks, hey, are we going to have another webinar for more advanced topics like RX, Hystrix, etc.?
Is this in relation to Ratpack or just in general?
I would assume Ratpack, considering the title of the webinar, but Shailesh, if you want to clarify that on the chat, that would be great.
If there's interest,
we've certainly had lots of webinars on Spring Cloud, and yeah, okay, he did say Ratpack. Yeah, that's what I thought. Right, just checking. So yeah, Danny, what do you think?
As long as there's enough interest for it, I'd be happy to talk about Ratpack and all the various modules that we have. There is a lot of material and framework integration from our side as well. So there's a lot to go over. I mean, yeah, I'd be happy to do it for sure.
Well, squeaky wheels get the grease. Thanks for asking, Shailesh. Maybe with Danny, why don't you and I talk about that, and maybe we can get something on the books. I think you did a great job today, and I'd be happy to have you back. And yeah, so let's talk about doing exactly that. I think that'd be cool.
All right, great. Thanks for the interest, Shailesh.
Yeah, no doubt. No. All right, so I think that's about it, folks. Let's wrap it. We're a little bit after the hour. Sorry for that, but we really do try to make extra time. And thank you for doing that, Danny. But we really do always try to make extra time for your questions, unless it gets ridiculous. Like a half an hour after the webinar, then usually we start to cut it off. But yeah. So, Danny, anything you want to say before we call it? I think this has been great.
No, I hope I've at least succeeded in piquing your interest in checking out Ratpack and seeing how Spring Boot and Ratpack are not mutually exclusive. You can definitely use them together in any kind of capacity.
Awesome. Yep, I totally agree. Thank you so much. And yeah, wonderful. Let's talk about maybe doing another topic. I think that could be cool. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time and attention and your questions. Have a wonderful day, and catch you on the next webinar.